Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're continuing the second part of my subclasses tier list, going over every single subclass in the game in exacting detail, covering their strengths and weaknesses and what draws you to play the character, and how powerful they are if you take 12 levels of that character. We're covering single class characters today, so 12 levels in the same subclass, and then in a future installment I'll cover these characters and their strengths as multi-class characters, but this will give us a great basis for understanding the strengths and weaknesses of the class before we talk about the class as added to other classes. I'm recording this the same day that I posted part 1 of this video, and so I want to thank everyone for the extremely helpful comments. I really appreciate everyone's feedback. I'm not going to move any of the subclasses as a result, but I do want to take the time to correct 2 errors from the previous video, and then answer a couple questions that came up pretty frequently in the comments. First up, I'm going to correct the most obvious error, which is that I swapped the icons for Eldritch Knight and Battlemaster. I even checked because I thought these looked weird, but the wiki has them backwards as well. So I saw on the wiki that they were like this and was like, okay, must have been right on the wiki. But of course those are backwards, so we need to swap those. Secondly, I mentioned a few times that Cleric Channel Divinity comes back on a long rest, is on a long rest cooldown, and of course that's not correct. It comes back on a short rest cooldown, so I want to set the record straight there. I also want to answer a question that came up pretty frequently, which is about the tiers. If the B and C tiers are going to be mostly empty by the end of this video, and as you can see, they're currently mostly empty. Why even have those tiers at all? The answer is that the design goal of Baldur's Gate 3, of Dungeons & Dragons in general, is for every subclass to be cool, viable, and powerful. This is a single-player or cooperative game, and the goal is to let you live out the power fantasy that that subclass represents, not to make you choose between different viabilities of classes. There's no such thing as a challenge mode class in this game, the way there might be in a roguelike or something like that. Every class is supposed to be really, really good at what it does because it lets you live out the fantasy of playing Dungeons & Dragons. So it's a testament to the balance work that went into this game that most of the classes fall in the higher tiers on the tier list. Overall, I think we will see very few classes that don't offer spectacular things to the player, and that's a good thing. So that's why these bottom 2 tiers are going to be mostly empty, because in a sense, every class that falls into those tiers represents a miss on the intended balancing goals of the game. I mentioned that I think that Battlemaster and Wildheart Barbarian are sort of the perfect balancing points for the game, and so every class and that means that those should represent, roughly speaking, the balance floor in terms of power level. Every class that falls below those may need to be brought up in terms of power level to meet that standard. Before I begin, I also want to reiterate that we're measuring these classes both on their raw power level, how strong are they when you've put them into a party, but also how versatile they are. How easy is it to fit them into a party? How greedy are they for items? How much do they restrict your playstyle? I'm also considering how easy is it to play, because I know that everyone watching has never made a play mistake, we are all perfect, but for other players, Honor Mode represents hundreds of hours of inputs, and play mistakes for those people are inevitable. So the amount of forgiveness that the class has is really important to your Honor Mode playthrough. That's one reason I think Eldritch Knight, for example, is such a powerful class. Being a tanky character with the shield spell and very good access to AC, you can almost never miss your attacks thanks to the broken nature of Tavern Brawler, means that even if you make several play mistakes with Eldritch Knight, you will be able to recover. Some of the classes that offer more raw damage or whatever are not as forgiving, and so I think that that's an important consideration when talking about how powerful these classes are. Also, just to quickly reiterate how we're measuring the tiers, in S+ tier I have characters that give you too much. They are balanced outside the normal balancing goals for the game and just fall outside the power level that should be appropriate to a D&D character. In S tier I have characters that are both extremely versatile, fit into any party, and extremely powerful. In A tier I have characters that are either extremely versatile or extremely powerful, but usually not both at the same time. In B tier, I have characters that are slightly less versatile or powerful than the A tier characters, and also not the other thing. And in C tier, I have characters that restrict your play in some way because of a drawback that the class adds to your party. Again, these are not bad characters, and the margins between these tiers are extremely thin. I do want to emphasize that again. But these characters add a sort of more restricted playstyle to your party because of something that they do that causes you to have to play around them in some way. Finally, in the bottom tier, I have subclasses that are still often good, but totally outclassed in the same role by another subclass within their same class. So, for example, a Valor Bard fills exactly the same role in a party as a Sword Bard. It doesn't really get any abilities that Sword Bard doesn't get, and Sword Bard gets lots of other stuff besides, and also does all the things Valor Bard does, but better. So, while it's still a great character, Valor Bards are still awesome. In the current state of Baldur's Gate 3 balance, they're just superseded by the existence of Sword Bard. So let's jump in and start talking about monks, beginning with the Way of the Four Elements subclass. Now, I rated monks B tier in my class tier list, which I know caused some controversy, but just bear in mind that we're talking about single class characters. Many of you are probably remembering your monk thief multiclass, who do 50% more damage than a monoclassed monk, as well as having the additional utility of the rogue's resource-free bonus action movements. Not that monoclassed monks are bad by any means. Of course, that's still an incredible character that does tons and tons of damage, but without multiclassing, they do give up a lot of the damage that you expect from most monk builds. And monks are squishy, so the main downsides of monks are that they are straightforward to play, but still very difficult to play, because play mistakes with monks can be very costly. With few defensive abilities, relatively low AC and hit points compared to other martial characters, putting your monk in a bad position is much worse than putting your fighter in a bad position. All that said, of course, monks still do dish out tons of stuns, do massive damage to enemies, and overall are an excellent class, so we're still working from a pretty high baseline when we talk about the monk subclasses. Let's talk about the Way of the Four Elements monk and what that actually gives you. Way of the Four Elements gives you a bunch of spell effects that you can cast using key points. Most of these spells are duplicates of other classes' low-level spells that you get at much later levels than those classes get the spells, and which will have worse DCs than those classes' versions of the spells because they key off your wisdom, which is going to be, typically speaking, lower than another class's main casting stat would be. Some of the standouts here include Chromatic Sphere and Ice Knife, both of which are very good. You can get, if you can get your save DCs high enough to be reliable, you can use Clench of the North Wind, which is the equivalent of Hold Person. But mostly you're here for the 4 unique spells that this character gets. These are Fangs of the Fire Snake, Fist of Unbroken Air, Water Whip, and Shaping of the Ice. And Fangs of the Fire Snake basically gives you ranged punches, as well as increasing your damage. Fist of the Unbroken Air gives you a ranged punch that pushes an enemy back. Water Whip, it pulls them towards you, and Shaping of the Ice lets you make a little ice block to block a doorway, climb on top of it, or do some cool things. The ice block is actually surprisingly good. It's something that can really be used to mess up enemy movement in combat. However, what you're mostly getting is the ability to spend key points on bad versions of another class's spell, which you would be better off just casting from a scroll, or on these unique spells, which the best of them, Fangs of the Fire Snake, just gives you an extra gives you the ranged punches, but just gives you an extra d6 of damage, which is mostly superseded by the passive additional damage that Way of the Open Hand monk gets. It's not that Four Elements monk has no role, it's just that they don't do a lot that the base monk class doesn't already do, and the things that they do are very costly. They burn through key points really, really fast. So even with their additional key recovery from Harmony of Fire and Water, they're still going to be even more short rest dependent than the already very resource-hungry monk. And you aren't getting much that you aren't getting from other monk subclasses. That being said, the ability to punch at range is a unique effect, and that's kind of cool. And the ability to create those ice blocks actually does add a little bit of dimensionality to your combat. And of course, monks are still just really solid regardless, but I think overall this class does not that much compared to just the base. The subclass does not that much compared to just the base class, which is very solid, but puts the subclass in B tier. Sorry, I said D6 extra fire damage on Fangs of the Fire Snake. I meant an additional D10 on the initial attack, and then D4 on the rest of your attacks that round, which is basically worse than a Open Hand Monk's ability to add just d4 plus their wisdom to every single attack. Now, you do get it a little earlier, which is why I think that this class isn't totally superseded by Open Hand Monk, but for the most part, the Fist of the Fire Snake is more of a cool ability that gives you, lets you look radical and do some cool tricks more than it is a huge power boost to the monk overall. Way of the Open Hand. Way of the Open Hand is by far the most common monk picked, and the one that you'll see very often in build guides for good reason. Way of the Open Hand's focus is doing massive damage, and combined with monk's already existing focus on doing massive damage, you can imagine that the damage levels you reach are pretty staggering. Way of the Open Hand gets you three main class features. One, it improves your flurry of blows, which is already one of the best abilities in the game, of course, by adding crowd control effects to flurry of blows. At the cost of no additional key points, and this is really important, you can either knock an enemy prone, stagger them, or push them. In a lot of circumstances, that's as good as stunning them, and so lets you double dip on your key points by doing an additional, by doing a flurry of blows, which costs you a key, but also effectively stunning the enemy if you can arrange it so that a push or a prone is as good as stunning them, which again, it often is if you can then like move away from the enemy so they can't get back to you and get back in range of you to make their attack on their turn. This lets you waste enemy turns while also outputting the massive damage that monk is known for, and of course you're the best of the monks at abusing Tavern Brawler as a result, because you're going to be making more and more consistent unarmed strikes than all the other monk subclasses. Not that they don't, but the Open Hand Monk is the best at it, and abusing Tavern Brawler is one of the best things to do in this game, of course, in terms of raw power level. At level 6, you also get to add an additional 1d4 plus your wisdom of one of 3 different damage types, which you can choose on the fly, to every single attack you make. You'll be making usually 4 attacks per round, because you will have a bonus action flurry of blows plus your 2 main hand attacks, and so that's going to be an enormous amount of additional damage, especially if you're using elixirs and other stat items to allow you to boost your wisdom to very high levels. You can combine that with the boots of Unlimited Kushigo to give you, which I'm sure I'm pronouncing incorrectly, to give you even more wisdom to damage and double dip on your stat, meaning that you will be able to double dip both on strength and wisdom with this character with the right item setup using elixirs and the boots. That is an enormous amount of damage, even without the additional 2 attacks from Thief, and the fact that one of the 3 damage types you can do is radiant damage is very relevant as well, because it allows you to apply radiating orbs, another one of the most broken mechanics in Baldur's Gate 3. You also, at this level, get Wholeness of Body, which is even better. It's a way to restore key points that's just straight up better than the 4 Elements way to restore key points, because it also gives you half your key back, but then gives you 3 more over the next 3 turns, and gives you bonus hit points. And the fact that that ability is just superior to the 4 Element Monks version is kind of insulting, to be honest. I think they need to fix that. And then at level 9, you get the key resonation abilities that give you some AoE damage, and also just let you add even more damage to every attack at the expense of key points. This gives you additional power to every single attack. You're on average dealing more damage per attack than the other monk subclasses, of course, and that just increases as you level up, because up to 9th level in Open Hand Monk, you continue to get good class features. Open Hand Monk does fall off a little bit in the very late game, because compared to other classes, other melee damage classes like Fighter at that point in the game, an action surging fighter is doing 6 attacks on their burst damage turn to your only 4, because remember, this is a single class monk, so we don't have the additional flurry from Thief Rogue. That means that while you do amazing sustained damage and are going to do probably as much or more damage than the fighter over longer combats, because you can do those 4 attacks every turn, and the fighter will only be making 3 on subsequent turns of combat. Action Surge, obviously, is only once per short rest, so it's only for high burst damage turns. Your initial burst damage is lower than dedicated burst damage classes like Fighter and Paladin, and since the game, Honor Mode specifically, and Dungeons & Dragons in general, is so heavily tilted towards burst damage, that means that a pure Open Hand Monk does suffer in some encounters where you really need to kill a high health enemy immediately. You do also, because you have very few defensive abilities and your positioning is very important, have a slightly harder playstyle in the very late game than those other burst damage classes, which are a little bit tankier, since you have lower AC and lower hit points than a fighter or paladin equivalent class. Your positioning matters much more, so it's easier to make play mistakes with monk overall. That being said, none of that is a huge penalty, and the incredible sustained damage, crowd control effects, and overall just massive burst damage available to Open Hand Monk puts them solidly in S tier. You may be wondering how it jumps straight from B tier to S tier, but remember, on the general class tier list, I was focused a little bit more on versatility. On the subclass tier list, where you've already decided what role this character is going to play in your party, we're going to tilt the scale a little more heavily towards power level, and so just the sheer damage, crowd control ability, sustainability over long adventuring days compared to other monk subclasses puts Open Hand Monk, I think, solidly into S tier. Shadow Monks. Shadow Monk is one of my very favorite subclasses, one of my favorite tabletop characters because I think they're just so cool. The ability to shadow dash between different areas of darkness is thematically awesome, and I think it's extremely powerful as well when it works. In Baldur's Gate 3, unfortunately, the lighting mechanics are such that Shadow Step is quite buggy, and in addition, in Baldur's Gate, there's a lot of other things holding back this ability compared to tabletop. Let's quickly go over what the class actually gives you, and then I'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses. So, Shadow Monk gives you the ability to hide as a bonus action, just like a rogue. It gives you a few level 2 spells that you can cast at the cost of 2 key points, those being Pass Without Trace, Darkness, Dark Vision, and Silence. Both Silence and Darkness are very useful to have on melee characters. If you combine the Darkness with the Eversight Ring, then you can do the whole Warlock Darkness ability, and of course you can get extra casts of Darkness if you're a Drow or half-Drow. So you can definitely benefit from those very powerful mechanics as well, and of course you can also just cast Darkness on yourself if you need to be immune to range attacks for a turn. 2 key points is a fairly steep price for it, but not so steep that it's not something that you won't want to do. And of course, Silence is just a very powerful spell overall, although given that Silence is a ritual that costs your spellcaster buddies nothing to cast and costs you 2 key points to cast, you're paying a lot more for the Silence effect than you would be if you cast it with a spellcaster. You also get the ability to become invisible while obscured, as in dark areas, and I have found this ability to be kind of a trap more often than not, because while you can inspect to see what areas of an arena are dark or not, the game is very inconsistent about what it actually counts as dark or not, and lighting conditions will randomly change while your character is midway through moving, or maybe like your hand will happen to tag the edge of a torch and it will break your invisibility, break your stealth, and enter combat when you weren't expecting to. The chance of entering combat when you weren't expecting to is much worse than the advantage you actually get from using this invisibility, so I think in general it's safest not to use it, although of course if you're very confident that you can use it safely, then you can get some edges with it. But since monks have basically perfect positioning regardless, thanks to their incredibly long move distance and jump distance, the invisibility to start a fight from where you want to start fights from is less powerful than it would be on another class. Then at level 6, you get the keynote feature of the class, the main reason that you are in this subclass is for Shadow Step. This lets you, as a bonus action, teleport from shadow to shadow, up to a range of 60 feet, so basically a Misty Step, provided that the area that you leave and the destination are both obscured. Again, the same caveats apply, but of course the game won't let you just walk you can only actually use this ability if it will work, so it's not like you're going to be bumped out of invisibility the way you will with the invisibility thing. I love Misty Step, and I'm probably one of the world's biggest Misty Step partisans, and this is basically free use Misty Step. You can use it as much as you want, it doesn't cost a resource, that doesn't cost key to use, and it gives you advantage on your next attack roll when you arrive. However, in Baldur's Gate 3, a bonus action teleport for a monk is significantly less useful than it is in tabletop, because items that give you Misty Step are extremely plentiful, and every character can jump as a bonus action. Monks get bonus jump distance, and of course, if you're playing a monk, a Tavern Brawler monk, which is the usual way to play a monk, then you're going to be using an elixir every day for 20 strength, giving you almost 60 feet of jump distance just by default, even without the monk's bonus jump distance. So the Shadow Step teleport costs your bonus action to do something that most of the time you can already do, and monks really need their bonus actions because that's how they do most of their damage through Flurry of Blows attacks. That means that you're giving up a lot every time you use this. The advantage on a single strike does not make up for giving up 2 more strikes, obviously. It's like True Strike, but even worse. And so this ability is only useful if you really need the mobility, and restricted mobility is worse, obviously, than unrestricted mobility like Misty Step, and a lot of the time you would have been able to get to the same point simply by jumping, because you're a monk with Step of the Wind, and additional bonus jump distance, and additional movement speed. So Shadow Step is, unfortunately, because it's one of my favorite abilities in Dungeons & Dragons, much less useful in Baldur's Gate 3 than you might otherwise think. Finally, at level 11, you get Shadow Strike, which lets you spend 3 key points. That's a pretty significant allocation of resources to do that. To teleport to a foe from a hidden position. They don't need to be in darkness for you to jump to them, but you need to be hidden. And then you deal your unarmed strike attack or weapon attack, and 3d8 additional psychic damage. This isn't bad. 3d8 additional damage is basically a Paladin smite, and it just costs your action, so it's not like you're giving up your bonus action the way you are for Shadow Strike. And the addition of a Paladin smite on top of Monk's already good consistent damage gives Shadow Monk a really nice burst damage option in the very late game. Of course, you have to wait till level 11 to get this ability, so it comes online pretty late, but it does patch one of Monk's only weaknesses as a damaging class, which is its relatively low burst damage. Of course, 3d8 damage, you will probably need to get some form of guaranteed critical to make that worth a lot, and psychic damage is a very poor damage type in the late game because a lot of enemies are immune to it. So it's not going to come up as often as you would like it to, and overall, the amount of damage compared to Open Hand Monk that you're giving up to get to this point is a lot. I think that Shadow Monk, unfortunately, because a lot of its abilities are duplicated elsewhere and better, you can cast Darkness from a Warlock, you can cast Silence from any spellcaster for free, its damage just doesn't quite keep up to the other monk subclasses, is just not a significantly different effect than just playing a monk with no subclass. It's super cool, and it feels really, really good to use this character. I think it is an incredibly strong role-playing option, and of course, like all other monks, once we add multiclassing back into the equation, it patches a lot of the weaknesses of this subclass. You can find many Shadow Monk builds that I've done on this channel, because I really like the class, but as 12 levels of Shadow Monk, it just does not give you much. It costs you damage and sustainability, because its main damaging ability costs 3 key points, and then you'll want to use a 4th to do a Flurry of Blows. And it doesn't have any way to restore key points, unlike the other 2 Monk subclasses. And what you get out of it is stuff that's already duplicated by Monk's core chassis, because the mobility is something Monk already excels at, and the bonus action teleport costs you one of your most important action resources in a turn. So all that put together, I think Shadow Monk is unfortunately a B-tier class, and that is just because of the circumstances of Baldur's Gate and the way that lighting is handled, and the way that every class has the ability to jump as a bonus action, when the unique thing that this character does is shared across every single class. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit worse. Paladins. Paladin is another class that was somewhat held back in the previous tier list because I was focusing more on versatility than on raw power level. Paladins have some of the highest raw power level in the game thanks to the incredible burst damage of their smites, and so you'll probably see them rank a little higher on the subclass tier list than they did at A tier in the class tier list. For Paladins, there are 4 subclasses, including one sort of semi-secret subclass, and we will begin by talking about Oath of the Ancients. Oath of the Ancients gives you a few different things. It's kind of the support paladin. It gives you Healing Radiance, which for a Channel Oath charge gives you your proficiency plus paladin level plus charisma modifier in hit points, which is going to be usually about like 10 hit points in the mid game, going up to 20 hit points in the end game, to you and all nearby allies, and then again the following turn. This is both a lot of hit points for just a Channel Oath charge, and then combined with your Lay on Hands is actually a pretty solid way to give you in-combat healing, especially because it's just a bonus action to activate, but also the fact that it triggers twice means that it double applies all the buffs from from buff on heal items. So if you aren't using them on a cleric, Healing Radiance is an excellent way to apply those effects. This gets you 3 turns of Blade Ward because it will re-trigger the effect. It gets you twice as many temporary hit points from the Vital Conduit boots if you've been taking additional damage, gets you 3 turns of Bless, and so on. That's a pretty significant buff, all on top of a very powerful healing effect, which as a bonus action is significantly more usable in combat than a Life Cleric's healing effect. Obviously, this is not healing in combat is still capped at sort of how good it can be because it's still not going to keep up with incoming damage, but the amount of healing that you get with this in an AoE from a bonus effect is very powerful. Basically, this gives you several extra casts of mass healing word per day, which is an extremely useful effect. You also get a Channel Oath action to restrain an enemy, mostly useless because the save DC will probably be relatively low unless you're drinking a lot of potions and maxing out your charisma. You'd rather usually just hit an enemy than spend an action restraining them, and an action to make Fae and Fiends become turned, causing them to flee, which is very useful in fights against them if your DCs are high enough to do it reliably. Your unique spell list on Oath of the Ancients Paladin is also quite good, including Misty Step, one of the best spells to get on a melee character, of course, and Plant Growth, which doesn't require save DC and so can actually be extremely useful, especially when combined with the aforementioned Misty Step. Now, of course, every spell that you cast on a Paladin is a smite that you're not smiting, and that's a real cost, so the spell list isn't a huge component of the Paladin subclass power level, but is definitely something important, and with a utility spell like Misty Step is really worth paying attention to, because while you won't always need Misty Step every combat, when you want it, you really want it, and having access to it just right from your spell list is very solid. Finally, I've saved the best for last, because at level 7, the unique aura that this subclass gives you is making you and nearby allies giving you resistance to damage from spells. This is halving all damage from spells, and most damaging spells do half damage on a successful saving throw, so combined with your Paladin saves aura, you are probably taking 1/4 damage on your party from all damaging spells. Not all spells are damaging, so this doesn't have an effect on a lot of spells that would otherwise be super dangerous, but against enemies that do spell damage, the Oath of the Ancient Paladin basically negates the damage by increasing your saves and giving you the resistance aura combined with the healing to heal up any damage you might have taken. A fireball dropped on the head of your party, if it does on average 28 damage, at 1/4 damage that is going to be 7 damage that you take, and then your healing radiance is going to heal up way more than that, and so suddenly this Paladin's healing is outpacing incoming damage, something that is almost never true for D&D healing. This is a very defensive set of class features, but it goes very well with Paladin's incredible offensive set of class features, because Paladin Smites are just some of the most damaging effects in the game. And while it does need some charisma, this Paladin can get away with not having that much charisma, because the save DC effects from your Channel Oaths are not the important parts that you get, and your spell list doesn't require you to have good save DCs to make the optimal use of Plant Growth and Misty Step anyways. Overall, Oath of the Ancients Paladin is therefore less multi-attribute dependent, especially if you build it with Dexterity, as in my build guide, the safest character in Baldur's Gate 3, so check that out for an Oath of the Ancients Paladin build, and I think is one of the easiest characters to slot into a party if you have need of a melee character, because you can mitigate the multi-attribute dependency by building them for Dexterity, and make your party very safe through all of the additional healing and damage mitigation that you get. Altogether, this makes your Paladin fit very well and do all the damage that Paladins are famous for. S-tier character, I think, pretty easily. Oath of Devotion. Oath of Devotion Paladin distinguishes itself in part by being, I think, the easiest oath to not accidentally break. This is something I should actually have mentioned for Paladins for Honor Mode, is that I think Paladin oaths, because of the somewhat inconsistent way Baldur's Gate handles breaking them, where often any crime will break your oath, I think it would be a rare player who plays all the way through Honor Mode without accidentally breaking their oath at least a couple times. And since the cost to restore your oath scales significantly, up to 10,000 gold the third time you break it, there is a financial tax to playing a Paladin. Now, money in this game is mostly free, but 10,000 gold is enough that it is kind of annoying to get your hands on that much, especially if it happens early. So Paladin rewards preparation, memorizing the story events that will break your oath, which is maybe not to everybody's taste, and also careful play around NPCs so you don't accidentally hit them with a spell or something, or pick up something that you weren't supposed to pick up and instantly break your oath. Oath of Devotion is one of the easier ones not to break because there are not that many story events, and they're all pretty clearly telegraphed because it's all just very evil things that break the Oath of Devotion Paladin's oath, so it mitigates that downside somewhat. For what it gets actually mechanically is Holy Rebuke, which lets you, as an action, make a single character deal 1d4 radiant damage back to melee attackers for 2 turns. Obviously, that's a terrible use of an action that will never do enough damage to justify casting it and spending the channel oath charge on it. Compare that to just making a weapon attack, and you need to get hit like 5 or 6 times in order to do enough damage back that it matters. Maybe with a Radiant Orb stacking build, you could do something with like a cleric with Spiritual Guardians and then Holy Rebuke on it and have them do the Radiant Orb stuff. I don't actually know if the D4 Radiant counts as you doing it or counts as the target doing the damage back. So if somebody knows that, let me know. You could probably do some sort of interesting Radiant Orb stuff with that, but other than that, this ability is useless. Radiating Orb, excuse me. You get turn the Undead and Fiends, which are the 2 best things to turn. Turning Undead and Fiends is going to come up a lot, so if you have high Charisma, you can turn enemies pretty easily. And your spell list is terrible, and the aura that you get is immunity to charm, which is mostly useless as well. The main class feature of Oath of Devotion Paladin is Sacred Weapon, which lets you use your channel oath to turn your weapon into a sacred weapon, making it glow, and also adding your charisma modifier to attack rolls. Now, for a monoclass paladin, this is probably less in terms of total attacks bonus, but this is still probably at least a +2 or +3 bonus for 10 solid turns, which is pretty nice. Compare that, though, to Vengeance Paladin's advantage on attack rolls, and you can see, because Vengeance Paladin is able to give itself advantage against certain enemies, I'll talk about that in a second, and you can see that +2 or +3 on attack rolls is probably not significant. So you really need to be maxing charisma and using strength elixirs or whatever to get the most out of this ability. If you do that, it makes your attacks more likely to hit, but still approximately equivalent to Vengeance Paladin's attack buffs, without Vengeance Paladin's anything else good. Oath of Devotion Paladin, unfortunately, that's the only ability they get that's good, and it's basically superseded by Vengeance Paladin's ability. So I think overall, Oath of Devotion Paladin falls in the outclass tier. Still an incredibly good class, obviously, because it's a paladin. You could still just kill things with smites and everything, and adding your charisma to attack rolls means your smites hit more often, so that's still a good feature. But if you want that feature, Oath of Vengeance Paladin just does it better in the current state of the game, so it falls into the outclass tier, where another subclass fills its same role, but better. If I wanted to fix Oath of Devotion Paladin and kind of give it its own unique niche, I think that step 1 would be to fix the bug with Oath of Vengeance Paladin, which we'll talk about in a second, and step 2 would just be to improve its spell list. The fact that it only gets Sanctuary as a relevant spell, and that's a level 1 spell that you're casting with Paladin spell slots instead of being able to cast it from a Cleric, means that it is held back significantly compared to the Paladin subclasses that actually get relevant spells, and its aura doesn't do anything. So I think it just needs slight tweaks to make it an accuracy-focused paladin, maybe add spells like Magic Weapon or something like that that could be more interesting for this character, but as it stands, its spell list doesn't help it, and its main class ability is superseded by another class. Since I just talked about the Oath of Vengeance, and Oathbreaker is sort of the secret 4th Paladin class, I'll talk about Vengeance Paladins next. Vengeance Paladins get really two main things that distinguish them compared to the other paladins. One, they get by far the best spell list, even better than Ancient spell list. They also get Misty Step, but in addition to Misty Step, they get Haste, which is incredible, although you do have to be a little bit careful when self-buffing with Haste. And they get Hold Person, making them the best paladin at using Arcane Acuity stacks, or even just having high Charisma in addition to a Strength Elixir, to guarantee critical hits. Guaranteed critical hits on a hold person target are incredibly powerful for Paladin Smites, of course, because they do massive damage with the Paladin Smites, and so you can benefit from that as well. You also get Hunter's Mark, which, while usually less damage than using that level 1 spell for a Smite, a level 1 spell gets you 2d8 damage, Hunter's Mark is a d6 on every attack. If you know that a fight is going to go long and has one specific enemy that you're going to be hitting over and over again with your Vengeance Paladin, Hunter's Mark is a pretty solid use of a bonus action and a spell slot, and will add up to more damage than using that spell slot for Smite will over the course of longer fights. So Hunter's Mark actually is a pretty significant addition to your damage as well. You also get Inquisitor's Might, which lets you add, as a bonus action, make your attacks do your additional damage equal to your Charisma. So if you are boosting your Charisma by taking 8 strength and 20 charisma and using strength elixirs to make sure that your attacks are actually hitting, then you can have very high additional damage on every attack. Plus 5 damage on every attack for 2 turns is pretty reasonable as a bonus action for a Channel Oath charge. It's not going to make or break most fights, but it's a nice additional boost for damage, and the fact that it's a bonus action means it doesn't usually conflict with other things that your paladin is attempting to do. You also get the same Abjure enemy, the ability to use an action to inflict a condition on an enemy. Frightened is worse than Oath of the Ancients Restrained, and neither of these abilities are going to come up that often, so it's not a huge component of the Paladin ability. And at level 7, instead of getting a really powerful aura, you get a very situational ability that increases your movement speed when you make an opportunity attack. Not something that matters that much. Oath of Vengeance Paladins also have their core class feature, Vow of Enmity, which lets you spend your Channel Oath to gain advantage on attack rolls against a specific enemy. And here is where something that's a little odd to judge comes into play, because in the current state of the game, this is bugged, where if you cast it on yourself, you just get advantage on all attack rolls that you make for the next 10 turns. This is a bug, because that's definitely not how the ability works in tabletop, and it's not how it says it works in the description, not how it's supposed to work, but it's a known bug that Larian have known about for a long time and haven't fixed, so it's not clear why they have chosen not to fix this, and if they've decided that it's just how the ability should work. And have just chosen not to update the description, although the descriptions in Baldur's Gate are hit and miss kind of regardless. So that puts me in kind of an awkward position for judging this character. Gaining 10 turns of advantage on every single attack you make is massive, whereas gaining 10 turns of advantage against a single enemy is still very powerful, but nowhere near the level of power that just free advantage on every attack represents for a paladin, who also loves to try to critically hit, and advantage gives you increased chances of critically hitting because smites benefit so strongly from critical hits. Luckily, I don't think it makes a huge difference to the placement of this character class, because I still think that Oath of Vengeance Paladins, thanks to their excellent class features, are an S-tier class. But overall, I think that I would like to get some clarity on whether that bug is intentional or not, and if so, what how to judge it, and if so, why they decided to make that change, I guess, because that's not how it works in tabletop. For now, you can continue to just self-cast Oath of the Vow of Enmity and gain advantage on all your attacks, and you will wipe the floor with a lot of enemies. I do think that even if this bug is fixed and you can only use Vow of Enmity on a single target rather than to gain advantage on everyone, Oath of Vengeance Paladin won't lose actually that much in play, because typically the advantage is most important on the character that you want to kill quickly anyways, and Oath of Vengeance Paladin, or Paladins in general, excel at dropping a single enemy quickly. That's what they're there for, is to use your smites, burn through your somewhat limited short rest, somewhat limited long rest resources to kill priority targets quickly. Oath of Vengeance Paladin does that extremely well, even without the bugged advantage against everybody, and so will still fill the Paladin's role excellently, and thanks to their very good spell list gains a lot of additional abilities that you wouldn't have otherwise. Oathbreaker. Oathbreaker is the secret 4th Paladin class that you get by breaking one of the other 3 oaths and then deciding to become an Oathbreaker. That means you're no longer paying the Paladin tax because you don't have to pay to regain your broken oath if you've decided to become an Oathbreaker, so it saves you that large chunk of change that you are spending if you accidentally break your other Paladin oaths and want to get them back. Oathbreaker gets a bunch of abilities, starting with Spiteful Suffering, which gives you advantage on attack rolls against a specific enemy, just like Vow of Enmity, and they also take a d4 damage plus your Charisma every turn. That sounds better, but it's significantly worse because instead of being an bonus action, it's an action, so it takes your full turn to activate this, and they get a save against it. It targets Charisma, which is kind of interesting, so some enemies won't be able to save easily against it, but this effect is so weak for an action that it's just never worth casting. Dreadful Aspect lets you frighten nearby enemies, and the fact that this is an AoE is pretty good, so if you have decent save DCs on Oathbreaker, then frightening nearby enemies is pretty powerful. And you can control undead, basically the same as Dominate Person, a reasonable effect that adds some utility if you can get your save DC high enough on certain undead. Your spell list is pretty weak overall, being things that either do less damage than just spending that spell on a smite, i.e. Hellish Rebuke or Inflict Wounds are just worse than spending those spells on smites usually, and Crown of Madness requires enemies to fail saves and is also currently bugged and doesn't really work that well. Darkness is the only really good one, and you need to have the Eversight Ring in order to make the best use of it, which is an item that's pretty in demand if you're doing any sort of darkness stuff. So overall, not an amazing spell list, some additional utility, but not incredible. The main draw here is Aura of Hate and Animate Dead, which you get at level 9. Aura of Hate gives you additional damage equal to your Charisma on every single weapon attack you make, and on every weapon attack made by friendly undead, which sounds awesome, but insultingly doesn't work. None of the friendly undead in the game have weapons, so this ability, this aura, does not work on any summons. So basically you're taking this aura to boost just your weapon attacks by your charisma in damage. That's very useful for a multi-class Blade Pact Warlock, but for a solo Oath of Devotion, or Oathbreaker Paladin, is just not adding that much damage. You get the same amount of additional damage from the Vengeance Paladin's active ability, and while it's passive, and so will come up pretty often, you've had to spend 7 levels not getting much out of your Paladin subclass in order to get to this point. The fact that it doesn't work with Animate Dead means that it is going to just not add that much damage on a monoclass Paladin. Remember, again, that we're judging monoclass abilities here. And so Oathbreaker as a monoclass, I think, again, just tries to do the same thing as Vengeance, but doesn't quite get there. It's just the damage-based Paladin, but Vengeance is just better at doing damage. The spell list is worse, and the overall abilities are just not as strong. Adding Animate Dead is a nice ability that is pretty useful, but then you're spending a level 3 spell slot, which is a paladin of an extremely valuable resource for a paladin, being worth a ton of extra smite damage, on Animate Dead, which you would much rather get from an ally if you're going for a summon build. Oathbreaker Paladin, as a result, I think just doesn't really have a niche. It's a damage-based paladin that just does the whole damage thing a little worse than Oath of Vengeance Paladin, and as its niche that it should fill, being an undead army, it doesn't work in the game, which I find a little bizarre and feel like has to have been some kind of oversight that this does not work even with your own zombies that you summon. Like, maybe they could fix it so that the Oathbreaker zombies have weapons so that it will trigger their Aura of Hate, or allow it to work with the Animate Dead skeletons, which do have weapons, but it only works on melee weapons. So this feels like it's just a design miss from that perspective, in that the cool thing that this character is supposed to do, power up all your undead allies, it doesn't do, because its ability literally doesn't work with the undead allies available in the game. As a result, I'm going to place it in the outclassed tier, and I feel like it would be an easy fix to give this a niche as a as a paladin that wants to support a horde of summons, but unfortunately in the current state of the game, it doesn't do that. Rangers. I rated Rangers A tier in my class list, which I think occasioned some remark from people because they thought that Rangers should be considered weaker. I disagree. I think that Rangers are incredibly strong, especially in the context of a mono-classed tier list, because Rangers are one of the classes that benefits the most from the restriction to mono-class characters in general. Rangers in Baldur's Gate 3 were given level 11 capstone abilities and consistent ability gain as they level up, making them one of the classes that benefits some of the most from going all 12 levels in the same class. You get actually a lot of really cool stuff as you level up in Ranger. Case in point, Beastmaster Ranger, whose beasts continuously gain in power every couple levels, gaining new abilities, all of which are unique and interesting, and more hit points and some additional stuff. There are 5 different beast summons that you can use: the bear, the boar, the dire raven, the wolf, and the spider. Generally speaking, at low levels, I think you're best off with the spider, and at high levels, you're best off with the raven, because its ability to blind enemies and poop out darkness is really powerful, and the spider's ability to web enemies and poison them at low levels is extremely strong. But in general, I think all 5 of the different beast forms have their uses in different fights, and you should base which one you are going to summon on what fight you intend to take at that point, and kind of your party comp in general. The main downside, of course, of Beastmaster is that the beast can die. It's not got great AC or hit points, and so it is quite vulnerable, especially if you leave it in vulnerable positions in fights, which means that Beastmaster Ranger requires more careful positioning than most other classes. That being said, if the beast does die, you're still just a sharpshooter archer, which is an excellent thing to be. You've got, archery fighting style, extra attack, and sharpshooter, so you're still going to be putting out totally reasonable, consistent damage in the fight, but obviously not as much as if your beast was alive. Since the beast only comes back on a short rest cooldown, the penalty for losing the beast is quite significant, so it's something that you really have to be aware of in play, and increases the requirements on your play somewhat steeply. I wouldn't say as steeply as some other classes, but still something that you just have to be aware of when you're playing. However, what you get for it is awesome. The amount of damage and utility that these beasts put out is incredible. Of course, just having multiple actions per turn is great, and the capstone abilities that they get have tons of utility. The Raven's ability to do multiple clouds of darkness every turn for free is basically unparalleled in terms of utility in the late game. It just blinds enemies, makes your whole party immune to darkness. Of course, this will play best with the ring and helmet that make you immune to blind, but if you're building a Beastmaster comp, you're probably going to want to use those and combine them with a warlock. I would recommend that in general anyways. And even if you aren't using that specific ability, then the other Beastmaster companions also have their uses as well. You also get additional damage every turn because the companions use your proficiency for damage. They add your proficiency to damage, and they add Hunter's Mark if you have that up to damage, meaning in the end game you can apply Hunter's Mark 4 times per turn for 46 of extra damage between your 2 beast attacks and your 2 main hand attacks yourself. I guess even more if you're using 2-hand crossbows. Overall, this is a significant amount of damage and utility, and combined with just the fact that Rangers, by virtue of just being sharpshooter, archery fighting style characters, already do great in stealth archery, or just archery in general is such a powerful playstyle in Baldur's Gate. It does not take much, I think, to make them just a really powerful character. I think that the vulnerability of the beast does mean that they aren't going to quite hit the ranks of S tier, but I think that Beastmaster Ranger is a solid A tier character, and in fact I think it's also notable as one of the characters that I think nails the game balance very well. You'll have tense moments, but always feel like you're doing something cool, and so I think alongside Battlemaster Fighter and Wildheart Barbarian, this is what the game should strive to be balanced around, this type of character. Gloomstalker. Gloomstalker occupies kind of a funny place culturally in D&D. This isn't super relevant to the strength of the subclass, but there's something I felt like talking about a little bit, because Gloomstalker Ranger plus Assassin Rogue was basically the first broken build that people discovered in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. It's kind of the first standard for really optimized build. And so Gloomstalker Ranger became kind of a byword for a min-maxy or munchkin-y playstyle. Wanting to play a Gloomstalker Ranger at a table in early 5th edition play, like if you went to a convention bringing a Gloomstalker Ranger, people would look askance at you because they'd assume that you were there just to purely min-max. Just an interesting facet of the history of this character. What the character gives you is +3, you get Dread Ambusher at level 3. You get +3 bonus to initiative, additional movement speed, and on the first turn of combat, you can make an additional attack for free, taking no action at all, no kind of action at all, and that attack does an extra d8 of damage. You also get bonus action hide, just this works the same as a rogue's cunning action hide, and you get the ability to turn yourself invisible outside of combat, which lets you basically start combat from the perfect location a few times whenever you have this ability available. The out-of-combat invisibility, even though it says that you need to be obscured to use it, that means to activate it, you don't need to be to stay unlike the monk version, you don't need to stay obscured and can move to any location in the arena while invisible and start the fight from wherever you want to start it in the perfect position. You also get Disguise Self, which isn't huge, but is a nice little bonus if you're playing as a face character. And then at later levels, you get Misty Step, which is, of course, a huge benefit to any character in the game, but especially martial characters who otherwise struggle to access it. Proficiency in Wisdom and Intelligence saving throws. Gaining proficiency in Wisdom saving throws is huge. Lots of characters will spend an entire feat on that, because Wisdom saving throws are so powerful. And it's one of the few ways to actually die with this character is to get hit by a Wisdom saving throw effect and lose your turn, because it's very hard to kill most rangers since they have resistance to all elemental damage and are ranged characters who are very far away from melee enemies. You've got bonus actions to hide and whatever, so you have Misty Step, so you're very resilient in terms of survivability unless you get CC'd in some way. But with proficiency in Wisdom saves plus your good Wisdom, you'll probably not have that happen. And then you also get at level 11 as your capstone, whenever you miss within attack, you can take another attack for free once per turn. So basically gives you pseudo advantage for your attacks on your turn. Since you're making 3 attacks in the opening round of combat, it's not impossible that one will miss, so this ability will come up pretty frequently. It's not a huge bonus to your damage, but is something that is pretty relevant. The main thing, though, is the Dread Ambusher attack. An extra attack to start combat means that you are killing an extra enemy much, much faster than you usually would. At level 3, this gives you 2 attacks to open combat with the bonus d8 of damage, which is a lot of damage, and that will kill almost any enemy in the game at that point, or almost any non-boss enemy in the game at that point. And then at level 4, when you get Sharpshooter, you get to add basically 20 damage to your opening round of combat, or 24.5 damage to your opening round of combat, plus whatever your bow attack and dexterity does. So this gives you a lot of additional opening damage, and burst damage in this game is of course heavily favored over sustained damage, so the ability to gain an additional attack for probably 20-25 damage at the start of most combats is going to make your combat significantly easier, because you're going to start just with one fewer enemy on the field in a lot of fights in the game. That, combined with your ability to start to position your character exactly where you want it, thanks to Misty Step and the out-of-combat invisibility, and the very good defensive abilities that this character gets, so even if it does get targeted, you have lots of ways to get out because you're a ranger, I think makes this class just an excellent class overall. That being said, the damage is somewhat capped. You only get 3 attacks. They are at max level when you are a monoclass Gloomstalker. They're very, very likely to hit, and they will do very good damage because you have Sharpshooter and everything, and you have the ability to reroll misses, but you won't reach the level of burst damage that other damage-focused classes will. You do that damage more safely than, for example, a paladin or a monk who has to get up close and personal to do the damage, but you aren't going to be one-shotting enemies the way a leveled-up fighter or paladin will do, and so that does cap your efficiency. But for builds that are focused around longer fights or taking out one enemy and then having the fights go a little bit longer overall, I think Gloomstalker is just an excellent character class, and it has the advantage of being incredibly safe to play because you have sort of inbuilt free perfect positioning. You can bonus action hide after taking your shots to make sure the enemies never target you. And if they do target you, you have all of the ranger's resiliencies and whatever, plus the ability to shrug off most wisdom targeting effects. I think that's just another solid A-tier character. And again, I think it's very close in balance to Beastmaster. I think they did a great job balancing those two ranger subclasses. Hunter. Hunter gets choice of 3 abilities at level 3, choice of 3 abilities at level 7, and then an incredibly powerful ability at level 11, which I'll talk about in a moment. This is a fairly backloaded class, meaning almost all of its power budget comes at the end of the class, which is definitely going to count against it because most of the game is played before level 11. At level 3, you get your choice between Colossus Slayer, Giant Killer, and Horde Breaker. And Giant Killer is for melee rangers who definitely suffer compared to other melee characters, so I'm mostly going to discount it, other than saying that if you want to play a melee ranger, it's probably the right pick and it's pretty reasonable. Horde Breaker allows you to make multiple attacks if enemies are very close together, and they have to be extremely close together, within 5 feet of one another. But extra attacks, as we talked about with Gloomstalker, are really good, and so even situational extra attacks are very powerful. And Colossus Slayer lets you do an extra d8 of damage once per turn to an enemy that's below full health. People love this ability, by the way, and when I say that Colossus Slayer is pretty weak, I get a lot of flack over it, but I just don't see it. An extra d8 of damage once per turn is 4.5 extra damage per turn. A Gloomstalker extra attack made at the beginning of combat is probably 25 additional damage, so you need combat to have gone for 5 turns before Colossus Slayer equals the damage of a single extra attack that you'd get from Gloomstalker, or from just taking Horde Breaker on Hunter Ranger and having that trigger come up. I just don't think that Colossus Slayer will ever add up to enough damage, even if you're getting regular critical hits with it, which is still not guaranteed. You still need combats to go very long before this ability actually adds up to more damage than making an extra attack with a Gloomstalker would, or extra attacks from Horde Breaker if you can manage to trigger those, which is possible if you're building a Hunter Ranger. You're probably going for Black Hole, which is the way to pull enemies close together for volley, and so you can trigger Horde Breaker with that as well. I recommend taking Horde Breaker on this character as a result, and I also just wanted to take a moment to talk about why I think Colossus Slayer is just weak, because the numbers just don't add up to as much damage as any of the other abilities. It also suffers from overkill. If you drop 2 enemies to 5 health, a Gloomstalker Ranger with its 2 attacks would kill both of those enemies. The Colossus Slayer Hunter doesn't, so that's just another count against it. At level 7, you get 3 basically useless abilities. Escape the Horde, giving opportunity attacks against you disadvantage, is probably the best, because if enemies get into melee, you can leave and then shoot. Advantage on saves against being frightened is pretty useless, because you should find frightened immunity, either through casting Calm Emotions or through Hero's Feast. And multi-attack defense makes enemies suffer penalties if they're attacking you more than once. This can be useful, especially if you're like a solo character or something weird like that, but in general, it will come up occasionally against some of the more powerful bosses in the game who have many attacks in a round, and some archers won't be able to hit you a second time, but the -4 penalty to attack rolls won't even guarantee that they miss their subsequent attacks. It'll be harder, but it's certainly not guaranteed. So I think Escape the Horde is the best of these 3, but which of them you pick won't really matter that much. But what we're here for is the level 11 capstone ability, Volley. Volley lets you attack every single character in an AoE, a big AoE, as an attack action. So you can do it multiple times per round because it just takes your normal attack. This is obviously super powerful because it doubles or triples the number of attacks you're making a round. And when you take your 2 attacks per round up to 6 attacks per round, suddenly the amount of damage that you're doing catches back up with the other ranger subclasses very, very rapidly. Hunter is entirely backloaded as a result, because this is one of the strongest abilities in the entire game, but you have to drag your hunter through many levels of just being relatively weak as a result. So what I'm going to say is that Hunter post level 11 is an S tier character, and so if you respec into Hunter at level 11, you're going to be very happy with your Hunter. But if you try to play your Hunter from level 1 to 12, which I'm going to assume for the purpose of this tier list, you're going to just be behind on damage compared to the other ranger subclasses and compared to other characters in general. You won't have the burst damage that most damage dealing characters need or offer any form of utility, and you don't get good defensive abilities either. So Hunter, as considered levels 1 through 12 all the way through, is a B tier character, but if you respec into Hunter at level 11, and just go with a monoclass Hunter starting at level 11, then it would be an S tier character. So just a split there because the class is so heavily backloaded in terms of its power budget. Rogues. So Rogue is, of course, the class that suffers the most from the restriction to monoclassing, and in my class tier list I rated it C tier as a result, because Rogue typically gets very little past level 3, since almost all of the power budget of Rogue is in its subclasses, and most of them don't get any bonuses, or 2 of them don't get any real bonuses past 3rd level. However, there are some interesting things going on with full class Rogues that are still pretty interesting to contemplate, and so let's talk about those and what the strengths of these subclasses actually are. We'll start with Arcane Trickster, which has the most different playstyle from normal base class Rogue, but also the most different playstyles within the same run of just about any other character, because your ability that you get at level 9 kind of changes the character, the character of the character a lot. What Arcane Trickster gets is the ability to add a few wizard spells to your spell list. Most of these have to be enchantment or illusion spells, which are typically saving throw targeting spells, and therefore not terribly useful to a rogue who won't have great save DCs, but you also get access to the whole wizard spell list. So you get to be a rogue with shield or a rogue with misty step, all of which are things that are really nice to have on a rogue. Even bad spell access, as we saw with Eldritch Knight, can add a lot of dimensions to a martial character, and so the ability to have a few different utility spells on your rogue can really help fill some of the gaps that this class otherwise has. You get a bunch of cantrips, most of which are damage cantrips, but you're going to want to take utility cantrips, because if you want to do damage, well, you're a rogue, just hit something. And you get enchantment and illusion spells at level 1, including Charm Person, Sleep, Tasha's, Color Spray, and Disguise Self. Having Disguise Self and Charm Person on an Arcane Trickster rogue means that you're actually a pretty solid party face, because you can get Friends, Charm Person, Disguise Self, and because you're a rogue, you have the skill expertises and great skill selection, so you can actually be a totally solid party face as an Arcane Trickster rogue, having access to some of the effects that make something like a Bard a top tier party face. Now, you won't have as high charisma as a Bard, Warlock, Sorcerer, etc., but you can do a pretty good impression of them thanks to the skill expertises that you have, and you get to have a lot of the other skills as well. Since you cast off of intelligence, you're incentivized to have relatively high intelligence, and the intelligence skills are mostly used in dialogue. So an Arcane Trickster does add the ability to have a rogue as your party face, meaning that you don't necessarily need a charisma character to fill that role if you have one. You also get, at level 9, Magical Ambush, which gives you the ability to, while hiding, give enemies disadvantage on your spells. This sounds like it won't come up that often, but actually is a pretty cool ability. Even if you only have 14 or 16 intelligence, and therefore not very high save DCs, those saves made at disadvantage will still be harder to pass than saves of other characters, of a dedicated spellcaster. Disadvantage is roughly equal to like -4, -4.5 against most enemies. So although since the base numbers are lower, it's probably closer to -3.5 or -4. But if you have 16 intelligence and then give enemies a -3.5 on that save, that's a harder save to make than a wizard casting that same spell with 20 intelligence. So giving enemies disadvantage is very powerful for landing spells, most notably Hold Person probably, because that's an enchantment spell that you can use. You can use it with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel if you want, but you'll probably have to bonus action hide and then cast Hold Person. And it must be said that in a world where Arcane Acuity exists, the ability to reliably cause an enemy to fail a save against Hold Person is much less valuable than it would be if that mechanic did not exist in Baldur's Gate 3. But if you're like me and don't like using Arcane Acuity, then Arcane Trickster is one of the actually most reliable ways to make use of Hold Person, which is one of the most powerful effects in the game. That being said, you pay for it because you don't get any damage steroids on this character at all compared to base rogue just the basic rogue damage. And basic rogue damage is well behind other damage dealing classes. So while you get a little bit of utility on this class and a little bit of additional cool stuff, and it's very, very hard for you to die on this character, thanks to Rogue's pretty excellent defensive abilities, evasion and uncanny dodge combined with shield, and combined with the possibility of getting shield and Misty Step, bonus action hides and dashes and stuff. You won't be adding a lot of damage to your party, but because Arcane Tricksters can be a party face and also give you and fill some other utility slots in your party that you need from spells, while also being basically unkillable, I don't think I'm going to rate them C tier, because while they don't do much damage, the fact that they can always get out of combat does give you some additional options in the in your playthrough. And so as a monoclass character, I actually think Arcane Trickster might even be the best of the rogues, and comes in at B tier. Assassins. So Assassins basically only get any abilities at level 3. Their level 9 ability is so weak as to be honestly pretty insulting. It's Disguise Self, a level 1 ritual spell available as a level 9 class feature. I mean, I'd rather have nothing, honestly. Don't slap me in the face like that. But at level 3, you get a very, very powerful class feature, which is that when entering combat, if you have used your action and bonus action or bonus action to initiate combat, you restore those actions at the beginning of the combat round when the combat actually starts, and any enemies who are surprised, you gain automatic critical hits against. Automatic critical hits are very powerful when you are a rogue, of course, because they let you double your sneak attack damage, but since you can only apply sneak attack once per turn, and the pre-combat turn where you fire your initial your initial attack doesn't count as a separate turn for that, so you only get one sneak attack in your initial 2 attacks, means that you are only doubling your just normal rogue damage, which is somewhat lackluster as a monoclass rogue. You also get advantage on attack rolls against enemies who haven't taken a turn yet, which is pretty nice. That's just a nice solid bonus that will allow you to trigger sneak attack more regularly and land your attacks more often. And since it's so painful to miss with rogues, the ability to gain advantage is both good for sneak attacks, but also good for stopping you from missing your attacks and being sad because you only get 1 attack per turn. Assassins basically get 2 attacks in the opening round of combat and are, if you use them to start combat, which you always will, and are excellent damage dealers for like the first 3 levels for the first 4 to 6 levels as a result of that. But when other characters start getting extra attacks and other class features that increase their damage, assassin rogue damage really starts to fall behind. This is a class that just does not get anything past level 3, and so you're spending the entire game basically getting weaker relative to every other class, and that's just not a spot that you want to be in. Your power spike coming at level 3 is nice, because that's one of the harder points in the game, but for the rest of the game, you're going to spend the whole game just feeling worse and worse compared to your other damage dealers, and it also restricts your strategy because you always have to initiate combat by attacking with your assassin to gain any use out of the assassin's alacrity ability. And sometimes you would rather initiate combat doing something else. Compare a critical hit from an initial attack from an assassin to initial damage from, say, initiating combat from hiding with a wall of fire, and you'll see that you are actually giving up a lot of damage to make use of the assassin's class feature, absent the additional damage that you would get from another character. And so you are actually actively hampering your party's damage in order to make use of this feature, which is the only thing that assassins actually get. As a result, I'm going to place them in C tier because they restrict your party's strategy and don't give you that much for it. The initial damage is very good, especially in the early game, but later on it's going to stop killing stuff, and then you will just be doing lower damage when you start combats in order to enable a character who still isn't bringing that much to the table. Thief. Thief gains an additional bonus action at level 3, and then another insulting ability at level 9. You get the ability to become invisible on a short rest, something that other characters get access to starting at like level 3 or 5, and that's just in general very weak for an invisible, for a stealth-focused character who won't usually need invisibility to get where you're going anyways. On the other hand, an extra bonus action at level 3 is an incredibly powerful ability, and that's why Thief is the core component of a lot of multi-class builds. But as a mono class build, only getting an ability at level 3 really does make Thief suffer compared to other characters, and the ability that you get, while it does increase your damage through offhand weapon attacks, it doesn't increase your damage relative to other characters, or to other martial characters, because you don't get extra attack. You can make 2 offhand hand crossbow attacks in a turn with Thief, but without extra attack, that's still only 3 attacks per round. A ranger, for example, could still make 3 hand crossbow attacks, 2 main hand and 1 offhand, and so would be doing more damage because 2 of them would be main hand attacks, which are typically better, while not, and Thief doesn't give you anything that those characters don't get. On the other hand, the utility from the extra bonus action is really good. Bonus actions can let you jump, and on a rogue, they can let you hide, dash, and disengage, all of which are really powerful and makes thieves very, very difficult to kill. They are excellent at positioning in combat because they have basically 3 move actions every turn if you want them, and so you can basically always position safely, you can almost always hide, and because, unlike other rogues, you get multiple attacks per round if you're using 2-weapon fighting of some kind, or you get 3 attacks per round, you will basically always land your sneak attack because you have multiple attacks, so you're much less prone to variance than other rogue characters who, if they miss their 1 attack per round, are not getting sneak attack and therefore are not doing the main thing that their character does. All that said, Thief is still just a damage-focused class that just does not do that much damage. The offhand weapon attacks are not going to be significant damage, and if you give up if you use one of your unique rogue abilities to gain the positioning that this character is good at, then you're giving up damage. And if you get to the point where you're positioned perfectly and make your attacks but don't actually kill anything, then that's definitely not going to pull its weight in terms of a damage-focused character class. Rogue, of course, always gives you skill access and everything, and Thief Rogue is no better at that than any other rogue, unfortunately. Arcane Trickster is probably the one that has the most uses for the skill access, because they get spells which can enhance their skill access. Thief Rogue's skill access is good, but nothing spectacular compared to other rogues. So the only thing that they get, the bonus action, is just overtaken by other martial characters because they just simply do more damage. Rogues not gaining extra attack means that their damage is always going to lag behind. Now, that being said, applying 3 sharpshooter attacks in a turn is still a lot of damage, so you can still be fine with an archer rogue with hand crossbows, but hand crossbows also limit you to worse weapons than using the main hand bows, because the available hand crossbows in the game are not that strong, honestly, and so real martial characters get the option to use more powerful bows as well. What Thief doesn't do is pull your party in a bad direction strategically like Assassin does. In order to get the most out of Assassin's abilities, you have to initiate combat with them. In order to get the most out of Thief's abilities, well, they just have to be using bonus actions, which they're going to be doing every single turn. So it's not the same, like, counter productive pull that Assassin has, but still just having a damage character in your party that doesn't pull its weight in terms of damage, I do think is a negative in Honor mode. And as a monoclassed character, Thief really suffers as a result, and your party is going to somewhat be held back by having a damage character that doesn't do damage in it. So Thief, I still think, is a C tier character, even without the kind of negative strategic implications of Assassin. Assassin at least gets way more damage as a result of pulling in that direction. Thief doesn't even get that much damage, and so while it doesn't pull you as far in the wrong direction as Assassin, it also doesn't do very much in the right direction, and so I think it's a C tier character. Alright, my friends, I have once again spent more than an hour talking about these subclasses, but I think it was worth going over, especially monks and paladins, which have really interesting subclass interactions, in quite significant detail, and so we're going to be breaking this video into a third part and returning shortly with sorcerers, wizards, and warlocks. I expect to have a lot to say about those subclasses as well, because especially wizards really change how you play the character depending on what subclass you take, so really looking forward to getting into those, but for now, we're going to make the cut in this video. As always, of course, if you've enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave a comment, like the video. Both of those things help me out a ton with the algorithm, and I really do appreciate it. And you could, of course, subscribe to my channel for more guides like this and other strategy game content. And if you've really enjoyed the video and want to support me further, you can feel free to leave some money behind by hitting the buttons underneath the video. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.